an association, all which was hoped would lead some to have a little bit of minimal personal skill and experience, perhaps to become self-employed, starting their own business. So they served as insurance associations, community groups for commonalities and camaraderie, and educational venues in teaching people, as it was called back then, self-help. In fact, one of the best books representing this was a public writer and philanthropist and social critic named Samuel Smiles, spelled like Smiles, S-M-I-L-E-S, Smiles. And he wrote a whole series of books, and his most famous one is called Self-Help. Another one is called Self-Responsibility. Another one is called Integrity. All of these were meant to be books that would help people learn to be self-responsible and be self-responsible enough, not only to put away some money on their own, but to undertake these types of insurance policies. So in fact, this is at one level. The private sector's response and method of solving the social problems of the emerging industrial revolution and urban life and a diminishment of the extended families of the past in older ages, when most people lived in agriculture. Before the 1700s, 90% of the people in Europe lived in the rural areas in one form or another of farming. And of course then your extended family were your insurance policies. You would have several children, and they were your retirement policy, because you would expect that your children would take care of you just as you had taken care of your parents and grandparents. But with urban life, we began to see more of what we now call the nuclear family, the mother, the father, the children. And as a consequence of this, there was need for individuals to become self-supporting and less relying upon a way of life of the extended rural family that clearly was incompatible with more urban and industrial society. But this management of self-help and self-responsibility and the networks of these friendly societies help to take care of these problems, which are no longer to be managed in that older agricultural life in the countryside. Now, the other element of this was that this 19th century, when government did not hardly taxed, government regulation was virtually minimal over industry, enterprise. It was the era of free trade. Great Britain became the hallmark and leading country of a free trade movement in international affairs. And it was also the period in which whatever types of local or government, what now we would call financial assistance, may have existed, was reduced. It was not considered in this era of old-fashioned liberal individualism to be the responsibility of the state. The welfare system that had prevailed, in fact from the time of Queen Elizabeth I, was radically diminished and reformed. What were known in England as the Poor Laws. I'm sure you've probably seen some reference to this in some history book. It was radically reduced and almost abolished. Now this meant that charity fell upon the private sector. And rather than people dying in the streets and nobody caring, in fact this era of laissez-faire, limited government, most burden and responsibility on the individual with minimal government in doing anything, actually became the era of cultivated, blossoming, and growing private charity and philanthropy. Now it is true that much of this in Great Britain, for instance, was fostered and cultivated on the basis of a strong religious faith. Many Christians in Great Britain believed that it was a religious calling that called them to do good works. Their calling was to bring souls to salvation, right? To proselytize. But when men are poor, when they are feeling hunger from a lack of meal, when they don't have a roof over their head, when they're concerned about the conditions of their family, how can they concentrate their attention on hearing your message about God and salvation when they are merely concerned with the growling in their stomach? So they believe that if we are going to bring souls to salvation, we must combine that with helping those in need to improve their material conditions of everyday life. And so there emerged vast networks of private charitable associations. It was the era of the emergence of a network of orphanages for the children whose parents had died or had abandoned them. It was the era of the emergence of private, both secular and religious, charity hospitals throughout Great Britain, and through them other parts of the empire. It was the era of the establishment of outreach organizations, such as the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army would set up workhouses, as a lot of these other organizations would, to have a shelter to put over a person's head, to give them 3 meals a day, to offer them a workshop area to learn a skill or a trade so they could once again, or perhaps for the first time, become self-supporting. All of this was seen as a way to help one's fellow human being, and then through that have the opportunity to proselytize, to save their soul through the faith. And it was phenomenally successful. Indeed, again, economic historians who have looked at the data from that period have pointed out that by the second half of the 19th century, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the amount of private sector charity and philanthropy was of such a large amount in Great Britain that total charity, the monetary value of charity in Great Britain, was larger than the state budgets of some governments on the European continent. It was estimated, again from the records, that middle and upper class women in British society were devoting anywhere from 15 to 25% of their free time to just charitable good works. Working in a soup kitchen, working at a place where clothes were donated to give to the needy who couldn't afford to buy new clothes, to maintaining shelters where people could find a place to sleep and be given this assistance. So it was not only monetary charity, but in-kind or personal giving of one's time charity. Large and famous people collaborated and associated in this. Cadbury Chocolate. The Cadbury brothers organized several charitable endeavors for this purpose, as did Lever Brothers, of Lever Brothers Soap. They were extremely active in this. It was viewed as a social badge of honor for members of the British aristocracy to give their name and public recognition to leading charitable organizations as the source to attract money. Now, nowadays, people find this unimaginable. Oh, you know, this must be an exaggeration. People are too selfish. They're not willing to give to others. Why, people would die in the street. People wouldn't give unless the government taxed them to do it. Well, to give you an indication of how different that era was, there was a very well-known economist named William Stanley Jevons. If you've taken some principles of microeconomics, remember marginal utility theory? Okay, Jevons was one of the economists in the late 19th century who came up with that concept and developed that theory of, you know, marginal decision-making, marginal cost, marginal benefit. He was one of the developers of that. But he also wrote on a lot of social policies at that time. And he was not an advocate of liberal free markets. He was not an advocate of laissez-faire, okay? He believed that government should have an active role to do this, that, or the other. But in one of his essays, he pointed out that the reason he was calling for government control of welfare spending, as opposed to the private sector, was not because people were giving too little. And they're too cheap, too selfish. No, he writes in this essay in the 1870s that the problem with private sector charity, people are too generous. People are too generous. They're giving so much money that people just follow around where the donations are and never get a job because private people are too generous. They're creating welfare bums by giving too much money out freely out of their own pocket. So he wants government to control welfare to limit spending because the private sector is giving too much spending. You're creating an underclass of people who just live off the charity. Now that seems bizarre to us today. But Jevons was a respected scholar of the time who followed these social issues.